Last fall, I was gifted a drum kit from Vicki Elwood, one of the owners of the Muse Theater in La Crosse, Wisconsin. We were rehearsing for a musical production, and I was asking her about setting up a drum kit to stay at the theater. That way, I wouldn't have to take my gigging kit to the theater, to home, to another gig, back to the theater every day in between shows. If you aren't familiar, and not every theater does it the same way, everyone's a little bit different, but generally speaking, when a theater puts on a musical production, it goes on for several weeks or weekends. Typically from Thursday to Sunday. Sometimes the Thursday is just on the opening week, sometimes the Sunday is a matinee that is just on the closing week, but you're usually looking at 3 to 4 weekends of shows, 12 to 15 shows. Some do more, some do less. However, I would have gigs during the week, almost every week, and it would just be a big hassle bringing my kit back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So having a dedicated theater kit would make things a lot easier. Well, Vicki tells me that there is a drum kit in the basement, and I can have it. I can do whatever I want with it, with the idea to turn it into a dedicated theater kit, so I said, absolutely, thank you very much. What I was gifted were these 1980s Pearl exports when they were made in Taiwan. I was given the kick drum and 2 rack toms along with a Pearl Forum snare. The floor tom was nowhere to be found, but that's okay because a 4-piece is great for 99% of what I do, and if I really needed a floor tom, I could take one off my Pearl Vision kit, since I have 2 floor toms for that, and I usually only use one. The condition of the kit was pretty solid, it was just cosmetically rough. Marks, scratches, dings, pitting on the chrome hardware, the shell wraps stained a nicotine color. I discovered they were originally white when I pulled off the hardware. Now, replacing the fumicine tension rods and broken swivel nuts, as well as putting new heads on, would have made the kit perfectly playable. However, I wanted to restore it, as I've never done that before, and I can make it look the way I wanted it to. Now, this is just how I did it, this is not necessarily the correct way to do it. I started by disassembling all of the drums, removing the heads, hoops, lugs, the tom mounting brackets, the kick drum spurs, the snare strainer. You can see the white that I mentioned. After taking everything apart, I laid it all out on this fancy blanket that was conveniently shoved in the kick drum. Next, I started cleaning the hardware. Every lug, tension rod, spur, tom arm, tom bracket, claw, swivel nut, spring, wing nut, anything that wasn't broken, I cleaned and reused, except the screws, bolts, nuts, and washers. Those aren't specialized drum hardware bits, so those I replaced, and buying them in bulk was incredibly inexpensive, and I was able to get them from a local fastener supply company. So how did I clean the hardware? First, I took a piece and soaked it in WD-40 for about 20 minutes. I soaked handfuls of pieces in several jars, or if the pieces were too big to fit, like the hoops or the snare stand, then I just covered them in WD-40 and let them sit. After letting them soak, I rinsed them in a bucket of warm water with Orange Goop hand cleaner, then I scrubbed it with triple aught steel wool. I could have used quadruple aught as it is finer than triple aught, but I didn't have any, and the triple aught didn't scratch the chrome, so I didn't see a reason to get it. If there were any trouble spots that I couldn't get off with the steel wool, then I used my rotary tool with a brass bristle wire disc, and that worked really nicely. I cleaned all of the hardware in about 8 hours. There were a lot of little pieces, and I wanted to get them as clean as I could. After getting the hardware cleaned, I took the shells to my parents' house since they have the equipment to prep and paint them. First, my mom and I took a heat gun to the wraps to soften them up, and we used a putty knife to separate the wrap from the shell, and a pair of scissors to cut them. They were very easy to cut, and we had all the wraps removed from the shells in about 10 minutes. Then we inspected the shells, noting some water stains as well as the lines of glue residue from when the shell wraps were originally put on. However, the shells were not warped, there were no cracks or splits, and the bearing edges were in good condition. So we sanded the shells inside and out using 320 grit sandpaper. Nothing fancy, just a real basic sanding to make sure they were smoothed out. We sanded down the lines of glue residue the best we could, but they were still visible even after 5 layers of paint and clear coat. Fortunately, they aren't very visible since they are in spots that are mostly covered by something else, like the tom mounting bracket. Sanding took about 30 minutes total. Lastly for the shells was painting. My mom, dad, and I taped off the shells and gave them 5 coats of navy blue fast-drying gloss paint. The shell sat for about 30 minutes in between coats before finishing with a layer of clear coat to give it some extra gloss and protect the paint. Before I could assemble these drums, I had to buy a few things for them. I went to SSE Music in La Crosse to buy some swivel nuts, rubber inserts for lugs, and tension rods to replace a few of the missing or broken parts. I had a few aquarium drum heads, but I needed a few more to complete the set. I decided to do something different with this kit, seeing as I only had a 12-inch tom and a 13-inch tom and no floor tom, so I went with two different kinds of heads to try to differentiate the sound a little bit more. A texture-coated head on the 12-inch tom and a Super 2 coated head on the 13-inch tom. I've got a high-velocity coated head on the snare, and of course the Super Kick 2 on the kick drum, which is the only kick drum head that I use. Classic clear resonant heads on the toms, high-performance resonant head on the snare, and a regulator resonant head on the kick drum. At the time I made this, I had the studio rings on, but I don't really use those anymore. I usually just use one piece of moon gel on the snare drum and nothing on the toms, and a small pillow in the kick drum. I don't like mounting my toms off of the kick drum, so I bought a pearl masking plate for the kick drum. It doesn't line up exactly as it's designed for the newer BB3 bracket, so I had to drill a couple holes in the kick drum to mount it. I didn't want to leave the hoops bare, so I bought some ribbon from a craft store and glued it on. Something else that I put on all of my drums are these Hendrix Drums sleeved tension rod washers. I'm a big fan of these. They eliminate metal-on-metal contact between the tension rod and the rim, they eliminate tension rod rattle when you're playing really low and loose tuning, and I've noticed they stay where they're at longer. And they come in different colors if you want to add flair to your kit. I just went with black because I bought a big pack for all of my drums. Side note, I chose to leave the tom and kick drum bridge lugs off. I just like the way it looks better now. So how does it sound? I recorded a quick demo using my Audix D6 kick drum, i5 snare drum, and F9 overhead microphones. I did have my F2 tom mics recording as well, but I didn't include those in the final mix, and honestly I don't remember why I recorded this like a year ago, and I don't have the raw audio files anymore. I have the clip with unprocessed and processed audio. I did this project a while ago, so I don't recall the exact amount of time or money that was put into it, but I can say that it was a weekend project and cost me less than $200. I already had the tools, some of the drum heads, I reused almost all of the parts, so this was significantly less expensive than buying a gig-ready kit or doing a restore when I didn't have any of those tools available. I would like to thank Vicki Elwood of the Muse Theater for gifting me this Pearl drum kit, my parents for helping me sand, prep, and paint the shells, my wife Katie for keeping me company in the garage while I cleaned all of the hardware, Marty and the crew at SSE Music, my go-to place for Pearl hardware, aquarium drum heads, Zildjian cymbals, Vic for drumsticks, and more, and you for watching. Thank you.